Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk a little bit about the passing of a wrestling legend, Jerry Jarrett, passing away at the age of 80. Yeah, Jerry Jarrett is quite possibly the most influential wrestling promoter of all time. Now, hear me out. Um, People will say, of course, Vince McMahon, probably the most famous, the most successful, the most well renowned wrestling promoter of all time. But Jerry Jarrett, I say, is the most influential wrestling promoter of all time because he gave a lot of these guys their starts in the business. A lot of them started off in his promotion. Hulk Hogan started off in his promotion. The Rock and Roll Express started off in his promotion. Jim Cornette started off in his promotion. Sting started off in his promotion. The Ultimate Warrior started off in his promotion. Macho Man, anybody who's anybody. The late Lenny Poffo, who just passed away. And of course, Jerry the King Lawler, who was, besides Jerry himself, the main stalwart of the promotion, the star of the promotion, and even rose to prominence to become the AWA heavyweight champion in 1988 under that banner of CWA, aka Memphis Wrestling. Jerry was also involved with the WWE from 1993 to the time his son left for the first time in 1997. And it was rumored that when WWE was going to go out of business, WCW was going to go out of business in 2001, that Jerry was going to be the one to buy it before even Endeavor stepped in, or before even, which was Eric Bischoff's company, or before even uh, Vince stepped in. We talked about with Lenny Poffo in the other video how Memphis wrestling is kind of in the whole Memphis area, not just wrestling, but even in the music sector and in the political social sector. Memphis, the city of Memphis, is experiencing an uproar. You know what I mean? The political issues, issues with the police out there, and the death of Lisa Marie Presley and Gangsta Boo and all that, and Lenny Poffo, who's a part of the wrestling scene out there, and then Jerry Lawler suffering his stroke. Hope the King is getting better. And then now Jerry Jarrett, you know what I mean, passing away. Jerry Jarrett, his promotion was such a part of the culture in the Memphis, Tennessee area, the entire Tennessee area, because for the longest, Tennessee as a state and Memphis as a city, for the longest, didn't have professional sports teams. They didn't have big sports teams. Even Jerry the King Lawler talks about it, that because Memphis didn't have sports teams, wrestling was the big attraction that everybody watched, that everybody was into, that everybody took a part of. And of course, Jerry Jarrett was the mind behind that. Jerry Jarrett was the mind behind the 1982 angle of Andy Kaufman, who was a big star at the time on the TV show Taxi, going on David Letterman and having his feud with Jerry the King Lawler, one of the first angles to involve a celebrity ever in professional wrestling. He was involved in the 1970s, the Tupelo concession stand brawl that he himself was involved with directly. The first Tupelo concession stand brawl. That was a precursor to the hardcore scene of ECW. Lisa says that I should do a video on the halftime show. Uh, um, Memphis was directly uh, responsible for the style of ECW in more ways than one, because Onita was involved in one of the concession stand brawl matches, and then took that style to Japan, which led to the founding of FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, in the 90s. And also, who was the original booker of ECW before Paul Heyman came into the scene. The original booker for ECW was the late Eddie Gilbert, and Eddie Gilbert was trained under that learning tree of Jerry Jarrett. So all of these wrestlers, and even Heyman was involved, of course, with Memphis for a while, but especially when he was with AWA, and Vern and Jerry had that deal where AWA expanded to the South, and the CWA moved out of the NWA because the NWA promoters wouldn't put the belt on Jerry Lawler, and Jerry Lawler was selling out. Man, those old promos that Jerry Lawler would do in the '70s when he was feuding with Bill Dundee. Bill Dundee. You could have swore Jerry Lawler had that Dusty Rhodes swag. He was almost black in his inflections and the way he talked, just like Dusty Rhodes or superstar Billy Graham. He had that jive talk wrapped down, and that was because a lot of the fans in Memphis, of course, were African Americans. Memphis is known for a large African American population. Beale Street, of course, black music and soul, and that's where the Rock and Soul Museum is from. Memphis, I often say, is the American musical version of Jerusalem. It's the home of three different types of music. You got hillbilly music, you got jazz and soul and blues music. So when it came to the wrestling, black people were just as involved in that as well, and just as much rabid fans behind that. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s, just as segregation was ending, you had a wrestler, Spudnik Monroe, who was a heel to most of the white Memphis wrestling fans, but a babyface to most of the black fans, and it was because of him. He actually stood up to the authorities in Memphis, which was, of course, a Jim Crow state at the time. And he said, look, if my fans come to see my matches, I don't want them sitting all the way up there in the balcony, which they would call the crow's nest at that time. I want them to sit front row seat where I'm sitting. So he was instrumental in ending segregation during his matches in the Mid South Coliseum, and actually he got arrested several times, for hanging out on the black side of town. You know what I mean? Because defying segregationist laws. And later on, Spudnik ended up in the only professional wrestler to be inducted into the Rock and Soul Hall of Fame in Memphis. You know what I mean? Uh, so that was crazy. And for Jerry Jarrett too, he was a prodigy, man. He was a second generation wrestling promoter. His his mom, Christine Jarrett, got her start with Nick Gulas and Roy Welch. Roy Welch, of course, one of the pioneers of Southern wrestling, starting the Mid America territory way back in the '50s. Um, Actually related to, I think it's the Hatfields or the McCoys, one of those legendary um, Tennessee Appalachian families that we always hear about when we hear about uh, the Appalachians and the blood feuds in the Appalachians. Um, and they later got into wrestling. And Nick Gulas, of course, we all know Nick Gulas famously for his inept son when he was promoting. He was promoting in Nashville at the time, and he tried to push his son, which inevitably caused him to go out of business. And then in the 1970s, it was Jerry Jarrett from Memphis who actually bought him out and consolidated the territory. Jerry Jarrett did that a lot. You know what I mean? He also did that in 1988 when Fritz Von Erich, because of his personal issues, the personal issues that he was having with his sons, with all the drug use and all the death in the Von Erich family, um, he actually Jerry Jarrett was the one who actually stepped in and bought the Dallas territory in 1989 and consolidated the Dallas territory, World Class Championship Wrestling. We talked about it. We have a video on this channel on the Von Erichs. And when the Hulu movie comes out, Iron Claw, that Kevin's going to be producing, we're going to be doing a video on the movie itself. But it was Jerry Jarrett who stepped in and who bought that territory and consolidated into the USWA. Later on, of course, he didn't buy WCW. We all know what happened to WCW. Vince McMahon bought it. But what he did do in 2002 was, of course, Vince had that public beef with Jeff Jarrett when Jeff held him up for money. He didn't want to lose that Good Housekeeping match to China in 1999, so he walked out of the company and went back to WCW, and he had that friendship with Russo. So when Vince bought WCW in 2001, of course he wasn't going to go back. I mean, Vince humiliated Jeff Jarrett right on TV. Remember the simulcast? Jarrett is looking at it. He's a GOGOONEE gone. You know what I mean? He humiliated Jeff, and he wasn't going to bring Jeff back. So Jeff really had no other alternative but to partner with his dad and found TNA Wrestling. And TNA lasted. Basically, TNA lasted until 2017, but you could say that under Anthem Entertainment, TNA or Impact Wrestling still exists today. You know what I mean? The name has changed, and the owners are changed. You know, Panda Energy doesn't own it no more. Dixie Carter doesn't own it. Jerry Jarrett doesn't have anything to do with it anymore. And part of the reason why he doesn't is because he wanted to sign this one Vladimir Kozlov, actually. You guys remember Vladimir Kozlov from like 08, 09? He actually came up to Brooklyn, interviewed Vladimir Kozlov. Vladimir had some Russian mafia connections out in Brighton Beach, and Jerry Jarrett interviewed him, and he was going to set him up with a contract with TNA with Bob Carter. Carter passed on it, who was Dixie Carter's father. Carter passed on it, and Kozlov ended up going with the WWE. But and after that, Jerry Jarrett was like, he did a Pontius Pilate move. You know what I mean? He washed his hands with TNA, and then TNA just became what TNA became. But he was initially the driving force behind the creative of even TNA, which was WWE's main competition after WCW folded. And another interesting story about Jerry Jarrett was in 1994 when he was working for Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon was going through his very public steroids trial, the steroid investigation by the federal government. They were investigating doctors that worked for him, particularly George Sahorian. Hulk Hogan testified in the trial against him, which they later made into an angle in 2003 with him and Hogan going into WrestleMania 19. But Jerry Jarrett was supposed to be, if Vince McMahon had gotten locked up at that time and he'd been indicted on charges, Jerry Jarrett was supposed to be the guy that was going to run the WWE. Now, according to Bruce Pritchard, who was Vince McMahon's right-hand man ever since 1988, when Vince bought out his mentor, Paul Bosch, in the Houston territory. Bruce Pritchard, brother love. I met him. He's a pretty cool guy. I met him in 2017. You know, he's a pretty cool guy to the fans or whatever. But and his podcast is legendary. You know, he basically started all the podcasts, and he would do the impression of Jerry Jarrett. He didn't like Jerry Jarrett. You know, chicken salad. You know. You get the walnuts, you know, and the chicken and all that, and that basically impression that Bruce does. But he didn't feel that Jerry Jarrett was going to be the guy and was going to, you know, be successful. within WWE, but hey, the facts speak for themselves. USWA or the Memphis Territory or Memphis Wrestling or Continental Wrestling, whatever you want to call it, um, was the only territory that Vince McMahon didn't get to, besides Jim Crockett. And Crockett ended up selling to Turner anyway in '88. But the only wrestling territory, the only small wrestling territory that outlasted them all. You know what I mean? He never got to him. He never got Jerry Lawler on the station. He never got Bill Dundee or any of the bigger stars. Tojo Yamamoto, who was Jerry Jarrett's partner in the '70s. He never um, purchased any of those guys, and he never took over the territory. When it came to Memphis, they were loyal to their Memphis guys. They were loyal to Jerry Lawler. They were loyal to Lance Russell as an announcer. You know, even when Vince was taking over the world, Memphis fans and fans in Memphis and fans in Tennessee in general, the Tennessee territory, they preferred the Tennessee style wrestling. And you got to give it up to Jerry. He outlasted the storm. You know what I mean? He was still standing when Vince took over everybody. You know what I mean? So Vince and Jim Crockett took over everybody, and he was still standing. So despite what Bruce Pritchard says, oh, he's just a hillbilly. You know what I mean? He never paid anybody, and that famous joke that Dutch Mantel always says. You know, they're doing business with Vince in '93, and Jerry Jarrett says to Dutch Mantel and says to the boys in the locker room, we gotta give up the steroids, and um, Dutch Mantel tells him, well, when you're paying us, shit, forget about steroids. We're not even on food. You know what I mean? That basically insinuating that Jerry was cheap with his payoffs, and he probably was because the only guy who ever rose to the top in that promotion was Lawler. But at the same time, nobody was as over as Jerry Lawler was. You know, um, with the exception of the fabulous Jackie Fargo, and that was in the '50s. Um, but yeah, rest in peace to Jerry Jarrett. Again, a true genius. The guy who gave Hulk Hogan the name the Hulk. He came in as Terry Boulder, and he teamed with Eddie Boulder, who was at Leslie Brutus Beefcake, and Hulk happened to be on a local talk show with Lou Ferrigno, who was playing the Incredible Hulk at that time, and this talk show host said, "Man, you're even bigger than the Hulk." And then Jerry heard it, and then finally, when Jerry introduced him on Memphis television, and this was in 1974, um, you know, he introduced him as Terry the Hulk Boulder, and later on he went to Vince in '79, and he became Hulk Hogan. Vince Senior added the Hogan part, but the one who gave him his start and gave him that name, the Hulk, and gave him his first championship was Jerry Jarrett. That's the guy he started with. That's the guy so many guys in the business started with. Everybody who's anybody passed through Memphis, even The Rock. Before The Rock debuted in 1996 on Survivor Series, he was as Rocky Maivia. He was Flex Kavana in Memphis because USWA was kind of used as a developmental territory, like they would use later on ECW and OVW and um, NXT. Now they used USWA for that, and they would send guys that they wanted to either learn a new hold or do something different with them, or guys that they were just starting out, like Rocky, and he was Flex Kavana down there. Kurt Angle, there's a scene with Kurt Angle before he debuted in '99, where he's down there in Memphis as well. So anybody who was anybody passed through Memphis, either starting out, or finishing off. Um, And it'd be interesting to see what Jim Cornette is going to say, because Jim Cornette, also another guy, he's from Louisville, and Louisville was part of that. Louisville, Kentucky was part of that territory, that Memphis territory, and he got his start there managing Sherry initially, but also Teeny, who was Christine Jarrett, Jerry Jarrett's mom, who again started off selling tickets. She got Jerry his first job. Jerry was selling things at the age of 7, but his first job promoting, his first job booking was at the age 14. But um, when it came to Jim Cornette, his mom, Mama Cornette, who was a famous part of his promos and everything, was a friend of Christine Jarrett, and Christine Jarrett would stay at his house and everything. And he talks a lot about that in his podcast, how Christine Jarrett and his mom were close friends, and that's how he got his start. Taking pictures at the ring, and eventually as a manager. And then when Bill Watts, in 1984, when Bill Watts had Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler come down, take a look at his territory, he was wondering why he wasn't drawn the way that he was drawn before, because he was relying on guys like the JYD, guys like Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And Jerry Jarrett says, well, where's all your blowjobs? And Bill Watts is like, what do you mean by blowjobs? You want hookers, get them on your own time. He says, no, where's all the young teeny boppers, the young handsome, athletic guys that could attract some of the female fans, like the Midnight Express, like the Rock and Roll, like the Fabulous Ones, and even like Tommy Rogers and Fulton, the Fabulous. The Fantastics. Um, all those guys. Bill Watts says, "Well, we don't have any," so they basically did a talent trade where Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express went down to the Mid South territory, and became even more successful. Um, Worked with Bill Watson and JYD himself in the last Stampede, right? A year later, and was basically in the main event. And from there, they went to World Class for a while, and then after that, they went to Jim Crockett, where they're on TBS. You know what I mean? So it was Jerry Jarrett who gave um, both the Midnights and the Rock and Roll their start. Also, um, he was one of the ones who started Michael Hayes too. Michael Hayes and the Freebirds were there for a while. Like I said, anybody was anybody. The mainstays there though was the Fargo brothers, and Tojo Yamamoto, who was the partner of Jerry Jarrett for many years. Um, on the Rock series that he does about the territories, Jerry tells the story where Mario Galento comes into the ring with a brick. Mario Galento was one of the guys in the '70s on a radio station in Memphis, Tennessee, who exposed wrestling. As many people know, people will say, "Well, wrestling been exposed since the '30s with Jack Pfeffer, right?" But that was in Jack Pfeffer thing. That was in New York, in the Southeast, in other parts of the country. The secret of professional wrestling, that it was work, that it was choreographed, was kept under wraps. So Mario Galento, he had a pay dispute with Jerry Jarrett. So they're wrestling, and all of a sudden, um, Mario Galento has this brick that he's hurling um, at Jerry Jarrett for real, and Jerry's like, "What the fuck do I do?" And all of a sudden, Jerry starts having to shoot on him, and it's not like Jerry Jarrett is a shooter, or like he's like Ken Patera, or he's like Kurt Angle, he's like uh, Jack and Jerry Briscoe. He's not of that caliber. He's not a shooter, right? But he had to defend himself. He was gonna die, you know. Another guy who got his start there, Jimmy Hart. Jimmy Hart, in the 1960s, was with his um, with his band, the Jimmy Hart and the Gentrys, and his music career after he had that hit "Keep on Dancing," I think that was like in 64, 65. He kind of uh, fell back, in the music world, but he was a huge fan of wrestling, and they brought him in as a wrestling manager, Jimmy Hart's first family, um, and that enabled him to become a manager in the WWF later on in the 80s, and a huge part of making the music that we all grew to know and love, especially Hulk Hogan's theme, Shawn Michaels' theme, and all that. So Jerry gave Jimmy Hart his start. Jerry gave, like I said, almost anybody you could think of, Coco Ware. Um, Coco Ware, we know him in WWF as Coco Beware. He had the bird Frankie, but that was in the WWF. In Continental, in CWA, in the Memphis territory, he was much more of a serious wrestler, even with Novell Austin as the PYTs. Of course, it's the early 80s. Thriller is the biggest album in the world. Michael Jackson is setting the world on fire. So you had the white version of a tag team that could appeal to the MTV generation, which Jerry Jarrett himself created when he put together Robert Gibson and Ricky Morton, and he tied the strings around their hands, making them look like Van Halen. Right? You had the white version of that because Van Halen was the biggest, like, heavy metal, hard rock band of the 1980s, in quote unquote white music. But you had to have the black version of that, and that's when he put together Coco Ware and Novell Austin. They were dressed in the Michael Jackson Thriller jackets with all the zippers, and they had the Jerry curls and the one glove and all that. So Jerry was really in touch with what was popular in whatever time, you know. And also, um, like I said, Andy Kaufman. Andy Kaufman, big wrestling fan, growing up in the Northeast. He contacted Vince Sr. because that was the promotion he grew up in. Vince Sr. didn't want to do anything with him. So he went down to Memphis, and it worked out even better because coming from California and New York, being an actor and being a native New Yorker, he was able to make fun of them. Oh, here in Memphis, he has the one promo where he says, here in Memphis, Tennessee, uh, they don't know how to take a bath, indicating that they don't know how to take a bath. This is soap. Here's what you do with this. You wash up with this, Mr. Lawler. And of course, he gets his neck broken. They go on the David Letterman show. Lawler slaps the shit out of him on the David Letterman show. And this is 1982. And fans at this time thinking, yo, this could be real. You know what I mean? Because, that's all bullshit wrestling, right? But at the same time, this dude looked like he really slapped him on a TV, and you don't think, David Letterman doesn't look like he's behind it. You know what I mean? So, what's really going on here? And that catapulted, of course, Jerry Lawler and Memphis wrestling to another level. You know what I mean? People still talk about that today when it comes to Lawler. Another one is the late Kamala. And it's funny because I was just thinking about Kamala, what was it, like a couple of days ago, because we hear the name Kamala, and of course this is in reference to the vice president, Kamala Harris. But as wrestling fans, when we think of Kamala, we think of the Ugandan giant, and it was Jerry Jarrett who gave him that gimmick. Jerry Lawler talks about it. Sugar Bear Harris, James Harris, he worked for a little bit in the UK, was not really getting over all that much. He comes down to Memphis. Jerry Lawler has this idea because Idi Amin's the president of Uganda at the time and was supposedly a cannibal. There was a lot of talk about Idi Amin. There's a movie that Forrest Whitaker has about him. It came out a couple of years ago, The Last King of Scotland, about the life of Idi Amin. But he he was well known in the 70s. He was involved in the Edinburgh plane hijacking in 1976 of an Israeli flight that was derailed by Palestinian hijackers, and Benjamin Netanyahu's brother Yoni died in that one, and he was all over the news. He was a famous dictator in Uganda, right? The butcher of Uganda. So Jerry Lawler has this idea for James Harris that he's going to make him into a Ugandan savage. And he read or saw on a map that one of the cities in Uganda is Kampala. So he comes up with the name Kamala, right? And they put the crescent on him. They put the stars on his chest. He's pounding his chest, and this is in the middle of Jarrett's backyard, his literal backyard. They're doing awesome stuff with Kamala, and Kamala in Memphis was actually intimidating. Later, they ruined him by making Playboy Frazier, aka Uncle Elmer, the white Kamala, and it looked just stupid. You know what I mean? And he moved on to other territories, Mid South and World Class, worked with the Von Erichs, worked with the Junkyard Dog. Then he worked, I think it was 86, 87 with Hulk Hogan in WWE. You know what I mean? And had his career, then he had his career the way he had it. And unfortunately, James lost his life, his struggle, his legs and stuff to diabetes in 2020, just around the time when Kamala Harris became Biden put her as the nominee for vice president. So that was pretty strange, pretty weird. But he gave Kamala his start. He gave, again, so many other wrestlers. Like I said, anybody who's anybody you could think of that was in in the bit. I don't know if Ric Flair um, ever wrestled in Mid South. I'm sure he probably. I mean, not Mid South. Memphis. I get a little confused sometimes Mid South and Memphis because the main arena that was like their version of Madison Square Garden or their version of the Omni. What the Omni was in Atlanta or what Madison Square Garden was in New York. Um, was um, the Mid South Coliseum. So you sometimes hear the Mid South and you think, oh, well, that was Mid South, the Louisiana territory, Leroy McGurk and Bill Watts. But no, it wasn't that territory. It was Mid South Memphis, um, obviously. And I heard this rumor before Elvis passed away in 1977 that Elvis was going to do a match with Jerry Lawler, um, karate star versus wrestler, because that was those mixed matches were the thing at that time because Inoki did the match we talked about with Muhammad Ali in '76 at Shea, so that was the thing. So I think Elvis, he was doing the karate thing towards the end of his life. I heard because Priscilla's wife cheated on him with a karate instructor, but that would have been huge um, when he came to that if they would have done that. And Jerry Jarrett would have done it because Jerry Jarrett, again, gimmicks. Memphis loved those gimmicks. Two-blow concession stand matches, um, uh, stuff with Andy Kaufman, all the crazy stuff, all the crazy things that you could imagine from professional wrestling, the crazy side of professional wrestling, the entertainment side of wrestling. Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler was really behind that. You know what I mean? So rest in peace to Jerry Jarrett. And wow, man, a guy who was so involved with professional wrestling for so many years. To be selling tickets at the age of 7 and start promoting matches at the age of 14. I mean, even Vince McMahon was not that big of a prodigy. Vince, at age 14, Vince McMahon was still Vinnie Lupton in a trailer in South Carolina. you know, you know what I mean? When Jerry Jarrett was doing his thing. But yeah, hitting Memphis wrestling big hard. Um, thank God. Well, now Jerry is. I mean, excuse me, Jeff is with AEW. But in 2019, when his grandfather died, again, even Jerry Jarrett's father-in-law, Eddie Marlin, was involved with wrestling. You know, so his roots go all the way back to that. But when Jeff Jarrett's grandfather, Eddie Marlin, passed away in 2019, um, that was the same year that Vince and Jeff Jarrett patched things up, and he finally went into the WWE Hall of Fame, and he appeared, in some angles with Elias. People thought it would never happen. People thought Jeff Jarrett and Jerry Jarrett would never be on good terms with WWE ever again, but apparently that's not the case. He's in AEW now. He's not working for WWE no more. But he's still on good terms with them, from what I know. And of course, he's a Hall of Famer. But a legendary wrestling family, one of the most legendary wrestling families. Again, we talk about the Paul Heymans of the world, the Vince McMahons of the world, um, the Dusty Rhodeses of the world, the Vern Gagnes, the Gary Harts, those geniuses. Again, we talk about those booking geniuses, the Pat Pattersons of the world, the people that are really behind the nuts and bolts of this thing, this crazy form of entertainment that we enjoy called professional wrestling. You can't talk about any of that without talking about this man, the Don of all Dons, the man who's been doing it for the longest of the longest that's still alive, and that's Jerry Jarrett. He could trace his roots back to uh, the early days in the '60s, and even further back probably. Than even that, doing one of the first invasion angles with Angelo Poffo and the Poffo brothers, like we talked about, introducing the world to the Macho Man Randy Savage. He first appeared on Memphis TV. Oh yeah, calling out Jerry Jarrett and calling out Jerry the King Lawler. Oh yeah, and in a way, he kind of first introduced us to heel Vince McMahon, because when USWA and WWF started doing their thing, Vince McMahon, Macho Man, Owen Hart, and Bret Hart went down there as heels to work with Jerry Lawler. Introduced us to Kane. Kane first came out as the Christmas creature before he was even Isaac Yankem in '95. In '95, when he came out as the Christmas creature, he was he was he was working in USWA. So again, so many wrestlers, so many personalities, so many angles start with Jerry Jarrett. Mostly every wrestler that you could think of, their story starts. Oh, I used to live in Memphis, or I worked in Memphis for this period of time, and Jerry Jarrett influenced me. So rest in peace to Jerry Jarrett. You know. Spend my days working hard. Oh no.